Crime data analyst Jeff Asher on the impact of the federal takeover of DC policing. That and more on this episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over today and sign up for our free weekly newsletter if you want to keep up to date with what's going on with guns in America. This week, we are doing a retrospective episode here, trying to look at the preliminary data for what happened with crime in Washington, D.C. during the federal takeover that was obviously very controversial and at the center of the news and is now being replicated by the president in other cities. At the moment, Chicago is where he has sent the Texas National Guard against the will of Illinois' governor and legislature. So the justification for these moves is that they've brought down crime, and so we want to try and assess whether that's true, and if so, to what degree. To do that, we have with us again Jeff Asher, who is one of the best crime data analysts out there, and has the top real-time crime data analysis publication, and he's back on the show with us. Welcome back, Jeff.
Thank you. I will say I was nervous to come on. I thought the Phillies were going to lose last night, and it would just be a disaster of a podcast recording. So I'm in a better mood. So that'll hopefully.
Yes, the Phillies. We're filming this on Friday, so they won Game 3 and are now on to Game 4, and
it's Thursday.
Whatever day it is, I don't know. It is Thursday. That's true. The Phillies, they've had me going here, but they did pull off the win last night, and now they just have to win 2 more in a row to survive. So we'll see if they can pull together. I mean, they've been very streaky, so I'm fairly confident in a touch of lighter news to start off the fairly heavy topic here with the military deployments and murder and crime and all that. So hopefully that brings some levity to people. But can you give folks just a reminder of who you are, or let anyone who hasn't listened to the show before know your qualifications and what you do?
I'm Jeff Asher. I'm a crime data analyst and consultant based in New Orleans. Have been doing data analysis for 19 years. When I started as a baby analyst with DOD, been doing crime analysis for 12 years, and I have been doing crime analysis as a consultant for the last 10 years.
And one of the things I think sets you apart, both your operation today and yours specifically, is the sort of real-time nature of the crime data that you're able to gather. The localities have actually become better at sharing those things. We don't have to wait for a year and a half to get the official like FBI data or on some of this stuff, although the FBI has also gotten a bit better at reporting these things. And so it's only been like a month or so since the federal takeover came to an end. And it only lasted a month. We'll get into some of the limitations of the data we're going to be discussing today towards the end, I think. But we do have some actual data to look at, right, from a couple of different sources, right? You did a piece just recently in your newsletter that went over the potential effects on crime of the deployment of federal troops, the National Guard to the city, as well as the deployment of a lot of federal law enforcement officials and the sort of partial takeover of the local police department, the Metropolitan Police Department. And we do have some data to look at. Where does that come from?
So we've got a lot of different sources. The most up-to-date source is the DC Police Department's open data feed, which is a little bit wonky and has been wonky for years in that they don't publish the crime categories specifically that the FBI publishes. So they publish sex abuse rather than rape. they publish assault with a deadly weapon rather than aggravated assault. And so what that means is that we're not necessarily seeing apples to apples from the DC crime data to what the FBI is going to be reporting, because they're reporting based on the DC criminal code rather than the FBI offense categories. It should generally match reasonably closely, and like homicide to murder matches really closely, theft, burglary, auto theft, all the same, robbery the same. It's just these two categories that make it a little bit challenging. Other sources are, obviously we have the FBI data. The FBI in August started publishing monthly data. So, but they do it on a delay so that the most recent data we have for DC is through July. So that's great. It's probably a slight undercount through July, but we can generally see the trends through the middle of the year at this point for DC through the FBI. And we can see that there's not really a lot of, there's not a lot of difference between the property crime numbers being reported by the DC and the FBI data. There are some differences in the violent crime figures, and we can certainly get into that later. Other sources we have, the Gun Violence Archive is terrific in terms of just having a collection of data going back a decade. It's not perfect. It's not precise, but it accurately shows the number of shootings in DC over time. We can see this by comparing to a DC Health Department data set dashboard that they just put out a couple of years ago that shows firearm injury visits to the hospital. So we can generally see what gun violence victims, and we can see based on where the person lives, generally what the DC gun violence trend is. And then we have CDC homicide data, which is only really complete through 2024, but you can see that, okay, we can believe the murder data is accurate based on what we're seeing from the CDC. So we have a number of different sources that can help to devise an analysis of what's happening. And it makes it much stronger because you can say, and there have been allegations of underreporting, systemic underreporting within the police department, and we don't necessarily see that with other sources. So.
Okay. And I know, I'm sure for a lot of my listeners, Gun Violence Archive will pique interest because that's mostly associated in media with their mass shooting count, and we've had, the head of the Gun Violence Archive on the show before to discuss this. But one of the big critiques of them is that they have a very inclusive, overly broad definition of mass shootings, and that's what people focus on. But in this case, obviously you're not using the mass shooting count. You're kind of using their regular shooting, just all shootings.
Yeah, we just want to track how many people are getting shot. Bullet leaves a gun, person is struck by bullet, and
they count
that change over time.
Yeah, and they use media reports. So you've got
not solely media reports, though. They do use police reporting as well, and I've seen them referred as, especially in locations that do a good, like New Orleans does a daily report by the police department, and so they pick that up and use that as well. It's not perfect, but we can compare Gun Violence Archive to places like Philly or Cincinnati, where they've got very exact counts of victims from the police department. We can see, okay, this is not perfect. They're not getting everything. It's not 100% accurate to what the police department is counting, but it is exactly measuring the trend. And we don't really care about the exact numbers. We care about the trend.
And so you're using, in your write-up, the Gun Violence Archive plays a role, but it's the less controversial aspect of that system, right? That's just counting of shootings. I just wanted to be clear for people, because I know that for some people, that they don't like the Gun Violence Archive, and I just wanted to explain how it plays a role in this particular situation. You can disagree with how they count mass shootings and still find that their data collection is reliable.
Yeah, certainly. And
so, well, let's get into, I guess, just right off the bat, what you found. What are the trends? We can start with, I guess, year over year, because that's what a lot of focus has been on. And then maybe talk about why you don't like that as the measure. But year over year, did you see a decline during this 30-day period that the federal takeover was happening in, and if so, in what categories?
I mean, yes, we see a decline, but we see a decline because it was declining. And so I think the real challenge with all of this is we, if we want to say what impact this had, you have to take into the context that in general, all of these different sources show their various metrics in DC were declining and declining sharply. And so the example, I was seeing articles coming out like, oh, in the last 2 weeks, it's down 48% relative to this time last year and down 40% relative to the 2 weeks prior. And it's like, if you've got a line that is going down and you do whatever intervention you want, and the line continues to go down, you're going to see year over year a percent change. And the great example is that you can basically replicate the exact same year-to-date findings that you could in August with June data, just through randomness. The fact that there was a large drop in violent crime in DC in June relative to previous years, and that just reflects a generally downward trend. What we find, sort of going through sort of category by category, if you start with carjackings, which is, I think, the thing that kicked all this off and is certainly a major issue in DC. Carjackings rose from pre-COVID, they had 10 to 20 a month, and peaking in 2023, mid 2023, with 140 in, I believe it was August or June of 2023. So it has since come down significantly, and 16 of the last 18 months, DC has seen a 30%, or 17 of the last 19 months, including September, DC has seen a 30% or more drop in carjackings relative to the same month the previous year. So you've got this sharp decline. July, before the intervention, had the fewest carjackings since May 2020. August had even fewer carjackings than in July. Do you credit this 60-something% drop in essentially both months to the intervention, or do you credit it to the pre-existing trend continuing? September, again, after the intervention, part of the intervention, you had a more carjackings than in July, which was pre-intervention. But you're talking 16 versus 18. You're talking about, relative to 2 years prior, you're talking about a 90% decline. So I think it's something that really speaks to the real challenge of evaluating the impact of the intervention at a time when we already were seeing really sharp declines across a lot of these crime types.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. That was my first thought when I saw some of the crime statistics being touted by the administration during the intervention. Is, yes, these serious crimes are down, but are they actually down more than they were already before the intervention happened? And that's the difficult part to suss out here, is trying to figure out the impact, not just, this is the flaw of just purely looking at the year over year change. As you outlined, yes, crime was down compared to the year before, especially compared to 3 or 4 years before. But that was already in effect happening in the city without the deployment of the National Guard or the flooding of the streets with federal agents, which obviously leads to all sorts of other questions about the president's authority to do some of these things, whether this is appropriate use of resources. There's a lot of questions that go on beyond was there an effect on crime, but so just establishing that that's the difficult problem here, figuring out whether or not there's any reason to think that the decrease in August was just part of a pre-existing decline, or whether it was actually caused by this intervention. With that in mind, with that being a problem identified, what did you see, or what's a better approach beyond year over year statistics? How do you go about trying to figure out the impact?
There's no ideal statistic and no ideal way to look at it. I think that the best way to analyze these things is using a variety of sources and looking at them in a variety of ways. My preference is to either do, if you've got such a short time frame, do something like rolling over 30 days where you're evaluating the number of crimes, today, October 9th, let's say this was September 30th, you would have the last 30 days. Today's point on the graph would be September 1st through September 30th. So now October 9th would be the last 30 days. And so you're able to measure changes with reasonable rapidity in terms of this is going up, this is going down. We're seeing the general trend, which was down, is continuing. If you're looking at a single event, this allows you to basically see where your pre-existing trend changes. You can do a shorter time frame, but the shorter your time frame, the more prone to being affected by randomness. Like sometimes crime just goes up and down over a 10-day stretch. And so it's hard, I think, to evaluate on such a short time frame unless you have a really impactful event. So like COVID, the first 10 days of shutdown, you see a sudden drop in the number of thefts and the number of traffic accidents and things like that. New Orleans had Hurricane Ida in 2021, and there was this enormous surge in business burglaries for, I don't know why, but you could see like within the 10 days of the hurricane, you could see that. But usually you need a longer time frame. And really, what you really want is a 365-day time frame. So if you roll something over essentially 12 months, you take out the seasonality. So December is going to have less crime because December is colder. August is going to have more crime because people are out and about. And so by measuring it over 12 months rolling or 365 days rolling, you're basically saying that, okay, I have every day of the year included in this graph. And so I'm comparing apples to apples. The problem with that is that it smooths out all the randomness. You see the changes as they develop. The real issue, though, is that it takes a long time. And I think that's the ultimate issue that we're dealing with here, is that if you really want to know whether or not an intervention was successful, you need months and months of data, because you need to be able to see a long enough time frame before and after that you can really say, oh, there's a real dip here and it's sustained, or okay, there was a couple of days of a change and that wore off quickly and the intervention ultimately had no effect. And to do that, we need another 4, 5, 6 months to be able to really make a strong determination. And nobody is that patient.
Sure, certainly. And since we aren't that patient, right? Obviously you've done some analysis to try and suss out what changes we can from the data we have, despite the limitations as you've laid out here. So what were the results, I guess? What did you see? Obviously we can, the President Trump has, as he often does, made very bold claims about this intervention and saying that it, essentially saved Washington, D.C., that it was a hellscape beforehand and now it's perfectly safe afterwards. I mean, obviously people tend not to fairly or not judge him on his literal words. Understand that he's extremely bombastic at nearly all times in these sorts of things, but it seems from reading your piece that certainly didn't happen, that there wasn't a massive shift that's extremely noticeable in the data, but that there was some effect that you saw.
So so if we look at overall violent crime, just measuring, because murder is a tiny fraction of our major crimes that we get counted each year, there's not really a ton of change in overall violent crime. Carjackings generally on the same track, robberies on the same track. We maybe saw aggravated assaults with a gun drop, but at the same time, DC breaks down violent crime into, based on the weapon, gun, knife, or others, which is, it could be anything. And so while we saw gun violent crimes drop, the exact same time we saw a big increase in both knives and others being categorized. So maybe that means fewer people are out carrying guns and committing fewer gun crimes. Maybe it means they changed up how they were classifying things and they were using the other category more often. Really hard to say without more data and more insight into their their data systems. We did see a drop in shootings using the gun violence archive data. But again, you have to contextualize it with, in July 2023, there were like 95 people shot. In December 2024, there were 20 people shot. So you saw, and not just because of the seasonality, but in general, you saw an enormous drop prior to the intervention. In September 2025, there were 14 people shot, which per the gun violence archive data is the fewest, in a month, in a decade. But it comes on the heels of that enormous drop that if you if you measure it over 365 days rather than the 30-day rolling average, it's barely a blip, because it's just continuing the trend that occurred before. So it's really hard to say, I think, with a ton of confidence, yes, this had an impact. No, this had no impact on specifically shootings. And then at the end of September into October, DC had a couple of really bad weeks. And so it's something that was the effect wearing off? Was it just such a small effect that it didn't have any long-term impact? I mean, it's, I think, really hard to say with a lot of confidence. Other than that, there does appear to have been a drop around the time the intervention started. And it's hard to, I think, tease out from the rest of the trend.
Well, what about murders? I mean, that's usually the most, I think, straightforward, at least in my impressions, the most straightforward as far as measuring whether murders happened or not, is usually go unreported, like a lot of other crimes might. What was the effect there?
So DC was having a big drop in murder. I tend to ignore murder from a measuring it as a thing that we can like draw analytic conclusions about, just because there's so much randomness as far as what happens when a bullet leaves a gun. And so for me, when you're looking at an individual city, it's I would rather ignore murder and focus on shootings, because that is a better metric for evaluating whether or not it's going up or down, and whether or not it's going up or down because of a change. We're dealing with New Orleans.
The idea there being like any shooting is effectively an attempted murder, but only some actually succeed in killing somebody.
And over time, it randomly goes up or down in terms of the share of your shootings that are fatal. New Orleans is dealing with this now. New Orleans has seen no change in its shooting figures over the last couple of weeks, but has had this horrific stretch of murders. And it's because 75 or 73% of shootings over the last 2 weeks in New Orleans have been fatal. And the average is like 30-something%. And so it's the highest percentage fatal over a 2-week stretch in years, which suggests, and everyone's freaking out because, hey, we've had this horrific stretch of like 12 murders in 14 days or something, but it's largely a result of randomness at this point. There's no evidence of a larger surge in shootings. And so I think that framing can be helpful. Alternatively, you often will say, we only had 2 murders this month from a big city that often has a lot of murders, and say, you had 2 murders, but you had 30 shootings. And so that was just randomness, and it's going to even out at some point.
Interesting. So you would put more credence in the drop in shootings as identified by the gun violence archive than in what's going on with actual murders.
Yeah, I wouldn't put much credence generally in murder figures at all.
Interesting. Okay. And you talked a little bit about why this is happening. Like what you do see some effect here, right? You've noticed even with all the limitations we discussed with the data and the fact that this is all preliminary at this point, and that the intervention was only 30 days long, right? And is over now, effectively. You do see some drop in some areas, shootings. I guess sum up for us where you saw a potential real world effect.
Well, the real world effect is more likely being seen in property crimes, and especially with vehicle burglaries and, to a slightly lesser extent, auto thefts. Other types of property crime, we don't really see a ton of change, but vehicle burglaries, if you track it over the months leading up to the intervention, those were generally rising. I mean, they're on a slow downward trend, but over the couple of, like, if you shorten your time frame to just the last couple of months, they were slowly rising, and then all of a sudden they start to drop. And it's a drop that isn't unprecedented. It's not something, it's not as big as it was in COVID when the shutdowns happened and you saw this just enormous 50% almost overnight drop. But it's there in the data in a way that we don't see for most other crimes. And so that one I think is interesting. It's plausible that it was just a one-time shock, and if we had more time, it basically will turn out to have been basically nothing. But when you want to say, okay, what is something that was not already dropping and the trend, it changed clearly enough that makes you go, this is actually a thing. Property crime and vehicle burglary is what comes to mind. That may or may not be mobility driven. There's the New York Times had a great piece on looking at things like cell phone data, open table reservations, and basically looking at, are people out and about as much? And there are numerous indicators that suggest that in August and September, people in DC were maybe not out and around quite as much as they were in previous months. And especially even if you compare it to the same time last year. So it's the type of thing that property crime, murder and gun violence does not require randomness. The victim and the perpetrator tend to know one another in some way. Property crime requires people to be out and about. And that's what we saw during COVID. And that's what we're, I think, seeing now in terms of potentially that. It's also possible that I'm reading too much into the change in mobility, that, there wasn't a lot of.
There were some other cities that saw a similar drop in mobility, right? But these similar metrics.
So I think it's hard to say that saw similar. DC had, in terms of the restaurant reservations, of the 30 or so cities that had each month of 2025 between January and July was up, DC had the biggest drop in August and September. But it's something that I think you could say it's very easily, I think, to read too much into it. And so that's why I would caution, again, just reading too much into it, that it might be mobility, it might not be mobility. This might be a thing, it might not be a thing. And so I think that's where the challenge.
Even the mobility thing was potentially caused by the intervention, right? There's troops on the street.
You don't want to go to restaurants because there's armed soldiers around.
Right. And it may also deter criminals, right? Which is the goal of this. Legitimately could be just deterring criminals from being out, and at least where the show of force is happening. That was one of the controversies around this deployment, is exactly where these troops were going, and so forth. But it would, and I would say it would be a little bit surprising if all of this had no effect on anything, right? I mean, you kind of expect.
Would it though? Because you're deployed. At least if we talk just about the National Guard, you've deployed a lot of non-law enforcement people and put them in places where crime doesn't occur. If you want to look at the federal agents and federal law enforcement assets being deployed, that was, actual law enforcement and working actual crime reduction. At the same time, there's 3,200 MPD officers. A couple of hundred federal agents is not an enormous change.
I think that's a fair point. It's just, I would be surprised for there to be absolutely no effect from it. Just from the visibility of it. Not to say that I think the question here is whether the effect is worth it, whether it's actually, worth the resources, worth the controversy surrounding using the National Guard in this way, in a way that's not usual, right? The National Guard is not meant to do domestic policing outside of, generally speaking, in my understanding, at least outside of rioting and maybe major event security, things of that nature, logistics, which, to be fair, I suppose they didn't in the DC deployment, they didn't try to push the limits, push the lines on what National Guard is used to. They kind of, as you're mentioning here, just had them stand around at Union Station or walk down the the National Mall or clean up trash and things of that nature, much more so than they had them actually out arresting anyone, since that would violate the Posse Comitatus Act. But yeah, I mean, you would imagine there'd be some effect. I guess the question I wanted to try and suss out with the interview here is just how much of an effect. Is it really worth it? Is it doing certainly anything close to what the president claims it's doing? And it seems to me that the answer is no, but that there is at least potentially some effect.
Yes.
Good assessment.
I think so. I think that you can't fully rule out. You can't say no, clearly no effect, and I certainly don't think you can say it had the opposite effect, that, actually everything's rising. We don't see that happening. What we generally see for most crime is that it continued on the track it was already on. And for most types of crime in DC, that was already falling, with the exception of vehicle burglary and to a lesser extent, auto theft. Everything else generally was about the same, is kind of my takeaway.
Yeah. And I mean, I guess, going back to the president's claims, he claims that there was a tremendous effect from this, that it basically saved Washington, D.C. I would think we can pretty definitively rule that out from the data, right?
Yeah. There's not a ton of evidence that it, I don't know, saved or certainly.
I just mean to say he's claiming
there's still crime in DC. These are still problems. Is the takeaway, and these are still issues that require attention and require solutions. And deploying the National Guard has not solved that, and will not solve that in the locations wherever they're deployed.
Yeah, and and then I guess the other side of it is whether, even if there was an effect, of whatever size, it's not clear that it's going to be a lasting effect, right?
Yeah, certainly we need more time, but you haven't really fixed anything if you deploy a lot of officers to one spot, and then you take them away. What have you done other than artificially deflate crime for a little bit? Like, you haven't fixed anything. You're not in the community. You're not solving the problems, and you're not preventing these problems from creeping back up again at some point. So
yeah. And so, because look, I think people can have their own, make up their own minds about what they think of these deployments, whether or not they're justified. Obviously, I guess on that point, the president he's claiming, crime is the impetus for all these efforts to deploy the National Guard in ways that it's not normally deployed. But I guess going back to what we've talked about on shows previously, the crime trends here, especially the murder rate, are all extremely positive, right? I mean, we're still on track to have perhaps among the lowest, if not the lowest, murder rate we've seen in decades, right? For 2025, is that still
certainly
the case?
I'd have the 30 cities that had the most murders in 2024, and murders down almost 20% in those cities this year through September. We're still on track for the exact same trends that we had before. It's very positive and very much no change. That we'll probably have the lowest murder rate ever recorded in 2025.
Right, and
would be my guess.
I mean, obviously there's still crime in all happening. It doesn't mean there's no murders happening. It doesn't mean there is no crime problem in places like Chicago or Portland or DC, where the president is actively trying to send the National Guard, has already sent them to Chicago, and I think he's trying to send them to Portland, but there's been a court order to prevent that. Look, I don't know. You can still believe that is the right policy. or that it will is necessary to protect ICE agents is one of the things that people have argued. Obviously, that doesn't have anything to do with what we're discussing here about the crime rates in DC. But I just thought, and there's a lot of reasons, even if, let's say, there were a bigger impact or more noticeable impact in crime data, there would still be plenty of reasons to oppose using the National Guard in this way. That's sort of more of a philosophical, political philosophical question. But I think it is important to understand what the data actually shows us out of this sort of test case that we've seen here in DC. And also not to ignore that there is some potential, benefit to this, whether it's enough to justify it, whether it lasts, are open questions. I am glad that you're able to come on and give us the insight into what the impact, at least preliminarily, right? Like, as you've cautioned a number of times here, it's important to understand that this is preliminary, that it'll be hard to know for sure anything until we're much further out from the deployment. But we have had enough time now that we can start, making informed guesses at what the impact was. And so I guess bottom line, just going back to the core of this question we're looking at here, what effect do you think we saw in DC over those 30 days?
I would say, given the purpose was violent crime reduction, we probably saw minimal impact, possible maybe impact, a little bit with shootings, but I wouldn't go out on a limb and say confidently yes or no anything. So I think it's really hard to tease out, and it's the type of thing that it was deployed in a place that was seen falling crime, and crime continued to fall, and that makes analyzing it very difficult. And if the argument is being made from a place that is not rooted in data, like, let's say if you want in good faith to try an intervention of deploying the National Guard to evaluate whether or not that deployment would reduce crime, you can't do it in a place that's seen a dramatic decline already. And so I think that from a data analysis perspective, you really need a better use case in order to, and Portland murders are down 50%, shootings are down 40-something% this year from last year. So you're going to see the same thing if you deploy there. So it's the challenge of trying to do I'll call it a novel crime fighting strategy, which I think deploying the National Guard for the purpose of fighting crime is, at a time when we're seeing the sharpest decline in murder and gun violence that we've ever recorded. It's very difficult.
Certainly the justification is hard to stomach, because I mean, that's sort of a justification for deploying them at any time, anywhere, because we're already seeing crime falling dramatically.
And polling shows us, I saw one poll, 75% of people do not want troops deployed in their community. And you imagine you're a National Guardsman or Guardswoman, and you're, forced to give up your daily life to go someplace where you're not wanted for a job that you're not trained for. And it's extremely expensive.
And in another state, in this case, in Illinois, they're sending the Texas National Guard because Illinois doesn't want to deploy their own National Guard. Like I said, there's a lot of reasons. There's a lot of controversy around this idea generally. And there's a lot of, then there's reasons the president has given and his supporters for why they think this is necessary. And then obviously on the other side, there's a lot of people who disagree. It seems like, as you mentioned there, a pretty unpopular policy from what the polling shows, just generally across even party lines. I think Republicans are still slightly in favor of it in the latest polling I've seen, but it's like 45-55 even among Republicans, which tend to very strongly back the president in most cases. But I guess the point here is we're not trying to settle the political question of whether or not this is the right thing. There's a lot of reasons beyond. This could have had an extreme impact on crime and could still be a bad idea, right? I guess is my point. Or it could have had, or you could think that this impact is still justifies what happened. I'm not trying to make up people's minds for them on that question. I just wanted to, drill down and try to see what we know about what the impact actually was in real life. And you're the person I trust most to give us the truth of what's, as best you can to what actually happened with the crime data. So I appreciate you coming on and doing that for us.
Always a pleasure.
Yes, and so we'll have to have you back on again anytime. Next time we want to look at crime trends, whether in a specific city or nationwide. But in the meantime, where can people go and find more of your work?
This is exciting. I get to pitch my own podcast for the first time. I have a podcast that I just launched, Datalytics podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. But my first guest was Michael Lewis. The second episode will come out next week with Laura Arnold of Arnold Ventures. And then I'm at Jeffalytics on Substack, which is, I think, jasher.substack.com.
All right, wonderful. Well, people should check that out. I'm going to be checking out that podcast because, like I said, I trust you most of anyone on this subject. And so I appreciate you taking the time to enlighten us here. And I'm going to check out your podcast. But that's all we've got for you guys this week. We will see you again real soon.